We're back, and we're here with David J. Williams. David, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back, Tom.
Now, it's been a little over a year since the last time we talked, and at that point, Mirrored Heavens was out. We talked at length about that book. Burning Skies was scheduled for release, and it came out in May of 2009. And now, the third book in the Autumn Rain trilogy, The Machinery of Light, will be released in May, completing this journey you've taken and the completion of your trilogy. First of all, congratulations.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
It's not every author can claim to have successfully made that journey, even after preparation. And second, are you ever going to write anything that doesn't start at a screaming run and then accelerate?
Not in science fiction, I suspect.
We talked earlier, and I told you that reading your books is a lot like driving a new Toyota around here. It just keeps going faster and faster and faster. I thought after the first book, you were at speed, and I was wrong, because in Burning Skies, aside from a short interlude at the beginning of the book, you pick up the pace.
I'm down with the Toyota comparison as long as they don't get recalled. my one caveat there. But yeah, the idea is essentially that it's not just an escalation of combat and that sort of thing, but that there are different ways to escalate it. I mean, in many ways, I think what's going on across the trilogy is a broadening of the canvas. I mean, when it starts, we have the characters as middle-level espionage agents, and within Burning Skies, by the time we get to the second book, they're really at the apex of power. I mean, they're right at the hand of the president themselves.
We had dealt with them tangentially, the people at the controls of the power structure in North America. And now we get to meet them individually. We get to see them more. I mean, Andrew Harrison, the president, often called the throne by the people in the books. We get to see a whole lot more about him and understand more about his motivations, his strengths, his weaknesses, than we might have expected after the first book.
Yeah, and that was very much, I think, a deliberate strategy, because what I didn't want was, you know, one of the typical thrillers where it opens and you see the president and the director of the CIA sitting around a table and they're studying some photography, and you see them immediately. In some ways, I thought it was like the way Tolkien left, you know, the really huge characters off screen. He left it throughout, but there was something about leaving the president off the stage in book one that by the time you actually see him up close in book two, you really start to think that's the president. I mean, it feels like we earned that moment and actually are, you know, seeing the leadership of the United States at that point.
And when you consider some of the other strong personalities that you've introduced us to, everyone from Matthew Sinclair to the other members of the hierarchy, you understand that only someone this strong, this complex, could control the kind of minds and egos that are involved at the top of the I won't call it, well, I guess you could call it the government, but the hierarchy that is running North America?
Yeah, that he runs the inner cabinet and is the overall president of essentially the Western Hemisphere at this point. And I think that was, again, another escalation strategy, is there's a certain sense of upward mobility with these characters, but there's also the broadening of the canvas where you start to see the events that took place 10 to 15 years ago. You get not flashbacks in the book, but just we learn more about those events, and so we're learning more about how all these characters relate to one another, how they're tools against one another. Harrison very much sort of the master manipulator up to a certain point.
Up to a certain point. And then we have Matthew Sinclair. And Matthew Sinclair is an absolutely fascinating and still not quite known character. Arrested at the end of your first novel and escapes by the end of your second book. And I don't think we're telling anybody anything, because when they take a look at the third novel, they're going to find out certain things have occurred.
Certain things have occurred, yeah, and I would also say he is still technically under arrest. I mean, there is this notion that he is in his jail cell and yet somehow has been able to hack through into the systems.
As a razor would be able to hack through
exactly.
into the system.
Exactly.
And at the end of the first novel, we found out a great deal. Claire found out a great deal about herself. Claire Haskell, who is, I would say, our protagonist, the person that certainly I'm following through the book, the person I identify with most directly. And I think what the person most readers use as their avatar as they go through the experience and the adventures that occur within these novels. Finds out things about herself she wished she didn't know, and finds out things about herself that, quite honestly, set her apart from the rest of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And we find out that she is, to an extent, in the same place, biologically, technologically, as Autumn Rain, who are our mysterious usurpers, the ones who are out to conquer and take over as the rulers of the Earth-Moon complex. And we also find out, to a certain extent, how they came about.
Exactly.
Courtesy in the beginning of the second novel, in the discussion between Mr. Harrison and a hack that Claire Haskell puts through to get to the impenetrable cell that he supposedly occupies.
Exactly. And you know, in some ways you just listed all the players there, right? I mean, Sinclair, you know, sort of the guy behind the scenes who created Autumn Rain, who created this unstoppable hit team that's more than just a hit team. And
well,
again,
it is now.
Exactly. And again is, you know, I mean, we see him for, I think, he's on screen for 15 pages in book 1 and 15 pages in book 2. And that's going to increase in book 3, but again, still very much in the shadows, very much sort of running things behind the scenes.
Because that's where his power lies. So it's appropriate that he stay to a certain extent in the shadows, because that's where his advantage is, that's where his edge is. So I think that works very well in the first 2 books.
Exactly. What you also have in Claire is, you know, I mean, she's sort of the daughter figure for him, in a sense, and someone who is, you know, the product of this experiment.
He has a weird way of treating his daughter.
Yeah, it's a complex set of issues, right? I mean, she loves him and she hates him, and, you know, one suspects ultimately the hatred is stronger than the love in terms of that particular relationship. But the product of an experiment, you know, that occurred 10 or 15 years ago, and, you know, in book 3 we're going to get to what is the nature of that, what is the nature of these particular powers that Autumn Rain has.
And we understand from a discussion at the beginning of book 2 that Autumn Rain has, you know, originally was a highly trained, incredibly professional, the best of the best cadre. They were basically the safety mechanism for the rule of President Hamilton under the control of Sinclair. And they became, after an attempted assassination, they were almost destroyed, and then secretly under Sinclair, they became something else entirely.
Yeah, they went rogue, and that's all against the atmosphere of paranoia this is taking place in, right? And it's at the end of a second Cold War. The United States, you know, is going toe-to-toe with the Eurasian coalition, East versus West, and the United States wanted a kind of ace in the hole, as it were, to deal with the East. So they conceived of Autumn Rain as a decapitation team, you know, that would decapitate the East's leadership in time of war. But of course Sinclair had his hands in there, and it became something more. It became something for some agenda of his that is clearly still being developed at the end of book 2. And again, that's sort of one of the things I was trying to do as far as escalating it. You're still not quite clear what's going on. I mean, we know that East and West are going to go head to head.
Well, and in the opening, you know, if anybody reads the blurb for book 3 for The Machinery of Light, they know they are.
Yes, exactly.
And quite honestly, when you read the scope of the conflict, you know, you have to wonder, considering what else has already happened, is there going to be anything left to rule over by the time we're done here?
Well, I think I got tired, of all those, you know, Hollywood movies where war gets averted at the last moment and, you know, everything's happy again. And in this, it went over the edge. I mean, you know, book 2 ends on that cliffhanger. We have the assassination of the U.S. president. Again, this is all on the cover of book 3, and World War III breaks out. I mean, the United States launches a preemptive strike against the East, and so it's not going to just be a bunch of nukes slung at each other, because each side has an industrial strength missile shield. Speed of light weaponry has attained maturity, and so the first thing you have to do is break the other side's defense shield. But that's all backdrop in book 3. I mean, that's entirely going on in the background while the characters were frantically struggling to figure out what is this mystery of Matthew Sinclair's? What's the secret that he's been moving all this towards?
And I have to say, after the after the road race that was Mirrored Heavens and the rocket sled that was The Burning Skies, the fact that you're accelerating it a little bit absolutely terrifies me. I'm almost afraid to open the book because I'm afraid it's going to race out of my hands and go somewhere.
The good news is it opens with a memo at the highest levels of the U.S. government that kind of brings you up to speed with everything and on the whole ensemble cast of characters. Because to your point, a lot of people have identified with Claire Haskell, others perhaps with Strom Carson, the aka the operative, but different people. I mean, Linehan was my editor's favorite character. I mean, one of the cool things I think about having an ensemble cast is that the author is essentially allowing you to pick and choose, and these obviously aren't characters where it's very clear that these guys are good and these guys are evil, because I didn't want to hand it to the reader on a silver platter and say,
right,
here's who you have to root for, here's who you have to root against. I want it to be much more shades of gray.
Which is essentially the real world. Any realist will say that it is that to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the situation and the personalities.
Mm-hmm.
But what I find interesting is that you were, with all that speed, it's a very delicate dance you do, because we do get to see the viewpoints of even with the casualty, still a relatively large cast,
Mm-hmm.
and we get to spend some time with them, even if it's only a few pages at a time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How hard was that to carry each of those elements forward and maintain a coherence against carrying forward the entire narrative, especially in the third novel?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely one of those things where you're trying to keep track of all these moving parts. I'd say as I mentioned last time, I mean, for every page of the book, there's several pages of notes behind that. And you can make that work to your advantage, right? I mean, these different plot vectors, if you will, can move in point and counterpoint to one another. So there's always some relationship between them, but at the same time, that slowly advances the narrative. I mean, so just as in book one, each of the characters has a different piece of the puzzle, and in book two, they all come together. Now we're starting to see that taken to the next level, where, as we say, what the final sort of mystery here is, each one of the characters is the key to that.
Let's talk a little bit about the creative process,
Sure.
because this is a accomplishment you should be congratulated on, completing this trilogy.
Thank you.
And having it published. But let's talk about two things. Process. A lot of authors that come onto the show talk about how the characters take them places they hadn't originally planned to go. But you've got a very carefully structured story arc, a history that you developed. And did you ever find them pulling you away from where you originally intended to go? Were there any adjustments you had to make at the back end of this storyline as a result of character development or things you discovered, or quite honestly, the continuing evolution of your own writing style that surprised you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my process very much depends on a lot of prep in advance. But in that prep, that's, I think, where you get surprised or not, as the case may be. So I never was one of those writers who could just sort of start writing and dive in, and then their subconscious starts magically singing to them about which direction. I mean, that just never happened. My subconscious has to be, much more sort of kept in line once I start writing. But at the same time, no, I mean, with that many characters, they're going to surprise you by definition. And that in some ways was, the key to the book. I mean, one good example is in book one,
Mm-hmm.
Where a lot of it takes place between Strom Carson and his former mentor, a guy named Leo Sarmax, a retired Praetorian who's living on the South Pole, in a hidden fortress on the South Pole of the Moon. In all the original drafts, I mean, Carson has to get sent in to kill him. And in all the original drafts, Carson does just that. He goes in and kills him. And then I suddenly realized just how much more of an interesting plot that would develop if Sarmax actually lived. And then Carson was pretending to his superiors that he was killing him and hiding that from him. And then the two of them start working together, and it suddenly took on a life of its own. So the machinations of the characters, their own agendas, came to the fore. And plus, the other rule there is, don't kill off your really interesting characters too early.
Well, I have another thing. Normally we would ask an author what's next, but since we haven't got the book yet, you get to stay.
Fair enough.
But I do have to ask, you spent a great deal of time preparing this world.
Mm-hmm.
the work setting things up, working beforehand. We talked about the years before the first book, and the rather rapid succession to the second book, and the different kinds of stresses and challenges that placed upon you. Now you've done the third. You've maintained your pace. You've put that third book out there. Bantam has accepted it. It's going out. We're going to get to read it. We're going to find out what the heck was he thinking about. And then you've traveled this world, you've established this world, and you've brought us to the end of your narrative. Does that mean that you stop and you have to start all over again with that world building? What is the next step for you as a writer?
I knew you were going to ask this question.
Well, as a writer, I'm not asking about the next book or when it's coming out, but as a writer, where do you go from here now that you've accomplished this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that's essentially what I'm sort of realizing it right now is, once I finished that book, the third book, and I literally just sent back the final proofs to Bantam about 2 weeks ago, and it's coming out this May, was this sort of process, this very almost bittersweet process of saying goodbye to these characters. So, I had the overall trilogy planned out. It was sold to Bantam as, book one in its entirety, and then book 2 and 3 were one-page synopses, essentially, that I wrote up off of my notes. But then being able to go on that journey with them for the next 2 years and find out how it really all ends and spell that out. One thing I will guarantee is there's no fake endings, there's no stealth setups to a fourth book, there's no never-ending series of the sort we've sometimes seen.
Well, I congratulate you on those approaches immediately. Thank you very much.
It ends. Book 3 resolves everything. Everything will be tied up. Everything will be explained. I don't rule out going back to that world again, but if I ever did, it would be, I'm not even going to say prequels, because it wouldn't even necessarily be those characters, just the world of the 21st, 22nd century, where you have this second Cold War, you have the worldwide internet that's been cauterized and balkanized along geopolitical lines, you have the weaponization of space and cyberspace, you have lunar fortresses and the whole Earth-Moon system divided between these two superpowers. That I could revisit, that particular dynamic I could revisit. And in building up the world with the timeline and everything, it might be a shame to not go back, but there's no concrete plans right now.
And for now, you're just going to take a break and kind of take a look at the landscape, in the case of this, the shattered landscape, and decide where you want to turn your writing talents to next.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very much the good news and the bad news story here is I'm at the crossroads, and I'm looking at. I've got a couple screenplays I'm working on unrelated to this. I'd love to get into graphic novels. Obviously, my original background was in video games with Homeworlds or with Relic's Homeworld, so that might be a possibility as well. It's nice to have those sort of options, but I haven't yet figured out exactly what direction.
Well, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask you to make us a promise. When you do figure it out and when you do decide, would you come back and tell us?
Absolutely. It'd be my pleasure.
Terrific. David, thank you very much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure, and I am really looking forward to the machinery of light.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Well, that's it for this edition of Fast Forward. We hope you found something of interest, and we hope you'll come see us again. Until then, this is Tom Schaad saying, take care.